Welcome to the 4Heroes podcast. My name is Bonnie Douglas, and I'm the Director of Operations for 4Heroes. If this is your first time listening, we are so glad that you're here. This episode was recorded live at a coffee shop during the 4Heroes Huddle with local law enforcement officers. It's been really exciting to see how many people have been listening and how many people have been impacted by Frank's message each week. Every opportunity that we have to offer hope and help is an honor. So please, spread the word, share the link, and let people know about the 4Heroes podcast. Like we said, each episode's going to be a little different, and this week, it's another episode from the 4Heroes Huddle. Today, Chaplain Frank Mercer begins a study in the book of Exodus. God's plan for deliverance is so obvious in the life of Moses. God heard the cries of his people, and the good news is, he hears our cries for hope and help today. We hope that you enjoy.
All right, we got a full house this morning. Glad you guys are here. Hope you've had a great week. We are starting a new book today. We finished Genesis. We're moving on to Exodus, second book of the Old Testament. It's an old book, 3,400 years or so ago. Moses writes Exodus, and people might wonder, why in the world would you read a book that's that old? And the thing is, it is still incredibly relevant. There's a lot to learn from Exodus. There's a lot of just leadership stuff to learn from Exodus that I'm excited about sharing with our Leos here. But beyond that, the whole theme of Exodus, you know how the theme of Genesis was beginnings? The whole theme of Exodus is deliverance and redemption. And deliverance and redemption is something that I need. Deliverance and redemption is something that you need. You've never locked eyes with another human being who didn't need deliverance and redemption. So Exodus is a big, big deal. It also introduces us to Moses. Moses' name shows up in 32 books of the Bible. There's 66 books in the Bible, 32 of them, almost half. Moses' name shows up in 852 times. Moses' name shows up in the Bible. He is the central character in the Bible, credited with writing not only this book, but all 5 books that make up what's called the Law, or the Pentateuch, or the Torah, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. We are going to embark on this. Exodus means departure, because that's at the core of the story. We just read about how Jacob's family got to Egypt, and we're about to read how many, many years later they left Egypt. So when they came to Egypt, it was a different time. It was a different Pharaoh. Joseph had saved the Egyptian people and really the world by providing food during a famine. Jacob's own family came to Egypt for relief, and that's how they got reconnected, and eventually they migrated in at Joseph's request with Pharaoh's stamp of approval. Here comes Jacob and 70 members of his family and entourage. You know, you could fill a couple of Greyhound buses and move them in. 400 years later, when they leave, it's not 70 people anymore. Estimates are about 2 million. Over those 400 years, there have been a lot of these little Hebrew babies made, and the population grew. Also, there was a new Pharaoh, a Pharaoh who had no memory of Joseph at all. And this Pharaoh saw the Israelites as a threat. He enslaved the Israelites to Egypt's service. He saw them as a threat not only because they were from someplace else, he saw them as a threat because of their growing numbers. And so popularity decreased as the population increased. Somebody eventually is going to come for my job. We're going to lose this great nation of ours to the Israelites if we let them continue to reproduce at the rate that they're reproducing. So he imposed a law that all the Hebrew male babies be thrown into the Nile River. Little girls can live. but the boys are going to be slaughtered. I'll read to you from Exodus, get you caught up. Joseph and all his brothers and all that generation died, but the Israelites were exceedingly fruitful. They multiplied greatly, increased in numbers, and became so numerous that the land was filled with them. And a new king to whom Joseph meant nothing came to power in Egypt. Look, he said to his people, the Israelites have become too numerous for us. Come, we must deal shrewdly with them, or they will become even more numerous. And if war breaks out, we'll join our enemies, fight against us, and leave the country. And so they put slave masters over them to oppress them with forced labor. And they built 2 cities, Pithom and Ramses, as store cities for Pharaoh. But the more they were oppressed, the more they multiplied and spread. So the Egyptians came to dread the Israelites and worked them ruthlessly. They made their lives bitter with harsh labor in brick and mortar and with all kinds of work in the fields. In all their harsh labor, the Egyptians worked them ruthlessly. These were bad days. Oppression. The Hebrew male children are being thrown into the Nile River, one of the most powerful rivers in the world. The focus coming out of chapter 1 goes from this big family of Israelites and the trouble that they're facing, and it narrows to one family. A couple named Amram and Jochebed. You pick up their names later on in the text. They have 2 children, Aaron, their son, and Miriam, their daughter. She gets pregnant. This is not a time you want to be pregnant. And maybe she gets pregnant after or just before the decree is given by the king. She keeps this pregnancy a secret for 9 months, and then she delivers a baby boy. How do you keep a newborn quiet? It's not easy. For 3 months, they hid him. And after 3 months, he became impossible to hide anymore. Every time he cried, they freaked out. They worried about what's going to happen to us, what's going to happen to him, if and when he's discovered. Hebrews 11 talks about the faith of Moses' parents. The faith that they had to do what they did. Here's what they did. They made an ark. Same word in the Hebrew that's used in Genesis 6 to talk about Noah and his family. Do you know how many people in the Bible were ever on an ark? 9. Noah and his family make the first 8. One more, Moses. Now his ark's a baby ark. It's a basket, but it is sealed with tar and pitch just like Noah's ark. I was thinking about this and couldn't help but wonder if when his parents were sealing that with tar and pitch and thinking about putting their baby boy in there, if they didn't think about Noah's story and how God had rescued mankind by having Noah build this ark. Hey, we were all saved because of an ark once. Maybe our people will be saved because of an ark this time too. They put him in that basket, all sealed up, and they put him in the Nile River. What the text says is they put him there in the reeds, the bulrushes. You know, it seems like a very specific place. I can't help but think that Jochebed and her daughter Miriam have done some recon. And they know that at certain times in this very specific place, the daughter of the Pharaoh comes to bathe. The Egyptians believed in a river god for the Nile, Osiris. And her bathing in the Nile was not just, getting clean. You can do that up at the palace. Bathing in the Nile was almost like a baptism. It was a spiritual cleansing, and it was a ritual. And she's down there at the Nile, and like clockwork, they knew when she would be there. They knew the place that she liked to go, and that's where they put the basket. There in the river, where he could be found by this specific person. And when she heard that baby cry, and when she saw that baby's face, her heart just melted. She automatically says, this is one of the Hebrew children. She knew. And all of a sudden, as if she'd come from nowhere, as if she'd dropped in from the sky, there's Miriam. There's the sister. Ma'am, would you like for me to find a Hebrew mother to help you in raising this child? The princess says, yes, that would be wonderful. And she goes and gets her mother, Jochebed. Pharaoh puts her on the payroll. I mean, he pays her to look after her own child. Well, she's going to have to give him up at some point. But you know what? She's going to stay with him long enough to be able to whisper to him where he came from, who he is. I really think planted this seed that you matter. I mean, you're going to make a difference. Your life is important, not only to you and to our family, but to this family. Not just to the 5 of us, but to the 2 million of us. I think he knew that he was made for something important. He's going to live 120 years, and we'll see over the weeks as we talk about him. You can really divide it. In fact, Stephen does in his sermon in Acts 7 into sort of 3 phases. The first 40 years, second 40 years, the third 40 years. First 40 years, he's in Egypt. The second 40 years, he's a shepherd out in the wilderness. The third 40 years, well, he comes and, spoiler words. I blew a spoiler last week. I hate to blow another one if you don't know the story of Moses. D.L. Moody used to say it like this, that he spent the first 40 years thinking he was somebody. Moses did. He spent the next 40 years believing that he was a nobody. And he spent the last 40 years watching to see how God would take a nobody and make them a somebody. I like that. I've seen myself in that cycle. You've probably seen yourself in that cycle of, I think I'm somebody. I get broken down and realize, no, I'm not. I'm not anybody. And then I see how God can use a nobody. That's a beautiful thing. One of the things that strikes me interesting in these first couple of chapters is that God doesn't make a lot of noise here. I mean, don't worry about it. There's going to be plenty of theatrics as the book goes. He's going to make all kinds of noise. There's going to be all kinds of stuff, explosions and rivers turning to blood and frogs and locusts and fire on the mountain, a bush that's on fire but is not consumed. So many ways that God is going to manifest his power and his majesty. But in these first couple of chapters, it's very, very quiet. But he's present, though. We've said before that God's silence is not an indication of his absence. He's present, always present in your suffering, close to the broken heart. The psalmist says he's present right there, closer than your hands and feet. He hears their prayers. What Moses writes in Exodus 1 is that God heard the cries of his people and he remembered. It doesn't mean that God forgot. He's saying we felt forgotten. We felt abandoned. You felt that way sometimes too, when you were working through your own dark night of the soul, when you were working through your own struggles and issues. There were times when you felt alone. Maybe you feel alone right now. I'm telling you, God is near. He has not abandoned you. In fact, he's got a plan to work all of this out. We sing a song called Waymaker. Even when I don't see it, you're working. You never stop. You never stop working. God is working. It's just don't give up on that. It's been 430 years. When we say 430 to be specific, but none of this has caught God by surprise, because actually in Genesis 15, God says to Abraham, know for certain that your descendants will be strangers in a land that's not theirs, where they'll be enslaved and oppressed for 400 years. God knew. God knew about the trouble that was coming. God knows about your trouble too. There is not one thing that you face or are going to face that's going to catch God by surprise. And He's near. He's close, so close, and He's working it out. Don't give up. Give Him another day. And if you don't have your answer tomorrow, give Him another day. And if you don't have your answer then, give Him another day. Wait on the Lord. That's the testimony of Jochebed and Aram and Aaron and Miriam. And they waited. They waited on God. Knew that He had a plan for deliverance and redemption. I have been a Braves fan since I was old enough to know what a baseball was. Today's the anniversary of Hank Aaron's 715th home run. April 8th, 1974. I know where I was. I was in my living room.
I was not here.
I did a cartwheel that night. That's probably the first and last cartwheel I ever did. So one of my favorite Braves is their catcher, Travis d'Arnaud. I love Travis d'Arnaud because he looks to me like a guy who could just slide in here to the huddle and he wouldn't look like he was a baseball player. My impression of him is that he's just kind of an ordinary guy, but he does extraordinary things that I can't do. Love to watch him play. We call him at my house Little D because the way he spells his name, it's the little D apostrophe capital A Arnaud. d'Arnaud. French, I expect. Little D. Little D. Little D's playing tonight. Little D. Little D. Moses is a deliverer, but he's a little D deliverer. The book of Hebrews, chapter 3, talks about the big D deliverer. That there is a Moses greater than Moses, and that's Jesus. Deliverer, redeemer. So while we're studying and learning about Moses as a deliverer and a redeemer, I want you to look for Jesus because He's all up in there. We got a lot to learn. A lot to learn from Moses and a lot to learn about Jesus. Moses may be able to deliver his people by the power of God from slavery and bondage in Egypt, but Jesus is able to deliver us from our slavery to sin, self, and bring us out of the land of death and into the land of the living, into the land of the promise. So I'm excited. I'm super excited. This is week 1 of a journey, week 2, and we'll be done with the first 40 years. When we finish next week, Moses will be on his run to the desert. And there's a lot of people running in the Bible. To things and from things, I guess that's not much different from us either. Interesting. Well, I think that's all I got to say about that. I'm glad you guys are here. Let me pray for you.
Thank you for listening to the 4Heroes podcast. We hope that you are encouraged to trust the Lord. He's always had a plan to deliver and redeem. Jesus came for that very reason, to save us, to deliver us from sin and death. Whether you're a first responder or a 4Heroes partner, we hope that you were reminded that God is present. Even when we don't see it, He's working.